Hello and welcome to the Nutanix Hybrid Cloud Overview. My name is Avinash Shetty. I'm VP of Product Management at Nutanix, and I kind of lead the go-to-market and the broader portfolio messaging around the entire product portfolio. In today's session, we're really going to learn the broader Nutanix story and how we are relevant in today's market, especially in the hybrid cloud world, and all of the features and functionalities that we support to support these customers and their business needs. Now, Nutanix is dominating the HCI marketplace. We pioneered this space about 10 years ago, and we continue to excel and show not just the ability to execute against a vision, but also the completeness of that, right? In terms of having a very strong strategy, a very strong roadmap as we continue to fill customers' business needs in this space. On the portfolio side, Nutanix's cloud platform really aligns to high-value solutions that customers are looking to deploy within their own data centers. So the way Nutanix thinks about our product portfolio is really anchored around two pillar products, what we call the Nutanix Cloud Infrastructure product and the Nutanix Cloud Management product. The cloud infrastructure product is everything that a customer will need to set up their own private cloud ecosystem, similar to those of the public cloud ecosystems. So this includes things like compute, storage, networking, and data services all coming together in tiers so that the customer can choose the right tier to match their business needs. On the cloud management side, you might have a Nutanix Cloud, a VMware Cloud, or on the public cloud ecosystem side, have AWS, Azure, GCP, and in this hybrid world, you need a common set of platforms and tools to manage these various ecosystems. So everything from like unified RBAC to things like day two operations to cost and governance and security and compliance, and automation and orchestration, all of these tools are coming together under what you would call our cloud management offering. Now, in addition to these two pillar products, we also have three solution areas that really go serve the customer in terms of their business needs. So one example of that is if a customer is interested in just external storage without compute storage, without the compute or the networking or the data services platform, then really you can have an external storage platform that is basically built on the Nutanix ecosystem. So that's our unified storage offering, and that brings things like files, objects, volume groups all together. We are in a unique position to address the vast majority of databases out there running, with very heavy levels of administration. So everything from provisioning a desktop to patching it to copy data management to lifecycle of these databases. Nutanix can offload our database engineers from all of those day-to-day operations and really take that on in terms of the tools and tool sets that we provide to actually offload that database management of the user. And last but not least, to run VDI or other end user computing solutions, we as a company are uniquely positioned. We actually got our first break as VDI as our first workload. And so we continue to actually invest in that area. And we have an entire line of services that's aligned for VDI as a use case. So when we think of our portfolio, we really look at it as, what types of customers are we servicing with our portfolio? And typically we find that customers fall into these four broad buckets. Now, I'm not saying that every customer falls within a one single bucket. There might be various departments that do, and so on and so forth. So just keep that in mind as we walk through this. But generally speaking, our customers fall into more of one of these four broad buckets. First one being they have legacy three-tier infrastructure, compute from vendor A, storage from vendor B, data services from multiple vendors, a hypervisor from another vendor, network from another vendor, and so on and so forth. And they piece together the solution, and there's a lot of challenges that we won't go through today in this presentation that a customer needs to go solve for that. The second type of customer is really somebody who's looking to modernize their on-premise data center, and have tried maybe other HCI solutions in the process, or maybe some converged solutions in the process. And so, that's sort of bread and butter for us in terms of sort of addressing them. The third type of customer is, and this is the vast majority today, I think, where customers are generally looking at a cloud first model, but they have a significant on-premises deployment as well. So whether it's cloud first or cloud smart, but they do have a sizable on-prem footprint. And again, there's a lot of value that Nutanix can provide to this set of customer. And the last thing is really for customers born in the cloud. So in other words, they have no on-prem footprint. They started out as a small startup, started in the cloud, which makes a lot of sense. And they continue to be sort of, primarily in the public cloud ecosystem. And this is probably where Nutanix's current portfolio probably is the least valuable to these type of customers. So if you look at what the Nutanix offering is, we have our enterprise cloud infrastructure solution, which really focuses on what we would call the mode 1, mode 2 type of customers. And then for the broader set, we have customers who want to take that on-prem footprint, move it to the cloud. So we do have some hybrid and hosted cloud services. And last but not least, from a multi-cloud, governance, operation, automation, cost, we do have a fairly complete solution to actually go augment those cloud first on-premise customers. Last but not least, where we're going with our roadmap going forward is really looking at data services that are more built for multi-cloud rather than just the Nutanix cloud or the VMware cloud. So this would work on things like Azure and AWS as well. So that's where we're taking our product. And last but not least, we're going to basically make some cloud native enhancements. So this is containerized applications for our data services as well, and that will be cloud agnostic. So more in future looking, that will really address sort of those born in the cloud customers as well, and some value proposition for them. So let's dig a little bit deeper into the first two buckets, which is the legacy on-prem customers and the modern on-prem customers. What is the Nutanix cloud offering that really addresses those two? And that's really our core cloud infrastructure offering. Now, when you think about a customer who wants to basically manage a cloud, they need some clean interface in terms of how they can actually view all of this information. And today, for the legacy and the modern on-prem customers who are not on Nutanix, they really get this view from 4 or 5 different consoles, right? So you're logging onto your hypervisor, you're logging onto your storage, you're logging onto your compute. So you're really basically logging onto multiple ecosystems to get one consolidated view. Whereas with Nutanix, you get this condensed stack. And right off the bat, going left to right, you can kind of see a quick summary of what's happening in your environment, some performance metrics, anything from a health perspective that requires attention, and same thing with any alerts that require my attention immediately. But going forward, imagine for a second that I'm a customer who's had the Nutanix product now for 6 to 8 months. What I can do is look at my historical trends in terms of consumption, and actually the system is applying some heuristics to really predict the future. So it does this for various metrics within the platform, so everything from compute to storage to CPU to memory and so on and so forth. And really what you're looking at is just those heuristics applied to your normal day-to-day operations. Now, depending on who I am as a company, I mean, I might be doing a lot of acquisitions, I might be in retail, so I have spikes in my business at various times of the year, and so on and so forth. These heuristics are clever enough to adapt to those changes. So in other words, I can basically look to know that February is going to be a busy month for me, and September is going to be a busy month for me. So I see a spike. What the system is doing is normalizing those spikes, understanding the business needs, and then predicting what that future business need is going to look like. Now, future business need doesn't always mean expansion. It could mean a lot of other things to customers. So one example of that is optimizing the existing resources that are on the cluster. Do I have over provisioned VMs? Do I have VMs that are misbehaving and require attention? Do I have VMs that are constrained, and so on and so forth? So there's things we can do within our ecosystem to actually clean up shop and make those resources available without always necessarily adding additional nodes into cluster and so on and so forth. Another example of where we can actually leverage the tools that are built into the product is really thinking about future expansion, future growth, and so on and so forth. So let's take an example. Let's say my budget cycle opens every 9 months, and so now I need to plan for the next 9 months in terms of what my growth is. I know we did a recent acquisition, so I know there are some new workloads that I need to bring on. So on this page, I can see that I have existing workloads, and then I have 2 new workloads that I've added on to this cluster. So the way you go about adding on 2 new workloads is you come to this add adjust button here. That brings up a screen that basically allows you to adjust the workloads as needed. So you get to see that I've added new VMs or new type of VMs. So whether it's a VDI workload, a SQL Server workload, and I give it a date, how many VMs are going to be of this type. I basically define those VMs, et cetera, and I hit save. And that brings me back to this page where I have now added these new workloads here. And what the system is going to do is recommend how many additional nodes do I need, if any, to accommodate these additional workloads. Now, I added a fair amount of workloads, so it's recommending a certain model with 12 additional nodes to my existing cluster so that I can actually accommodate all these changes. I can generate a PDF, I can hand that to my management chain and say, hey, by the way, before my next budget cycle, knowing what we have planned for these clusters, these are the amount of resources that I'm going to need, and print that, and hopefully. So when you think about security today, most customers tend to put their security for north-south firewall. There's usually like a Palo Alto firewall that's sitting at the edge of their network, protecting you from outside hackers. But the real threat these days, while the real threat from the outside still exists, there's another threat, which is the threat on the inside. So in other words, take a bad employee scenario, take a compromised VM scenario. Any one of these are an example of somebody or something on the inside that is, now been compromised, has access to information that is sitting right next to it that is unprotected, right? So imagine a web server that's compromised, a database server containing, customer credit cards and so on and so forth is sitting on the same network, and now you need to secure this. So the way to do that in the more traditional approach is to basically put a Palo Alto firewall, separate these out by VLANs, configure some ACLs and policies to make sure that the database doesn't have access. Now that is tedious, cumbersome, time consuming, and over time, nobody remembers why these ACLs exist and what flow policies exist and so on and so forth. And it just becomes a nightmare to manage on a regular basis. Instead, a cleaner approach is really thinking about network segmentation, and basically securing your applications in that fashion. So here is an example of a very flat network without having any VLAN separation, and I have an application that I'm trying to protect. So this happens to be a VDI application. So I have a XenApp deployment, a Zen desktop deployment. I have a couple of SQL servers, I have a couple of domain controllers, and so on and so forth. And this is the application. So I can immediately see within our Flow ecosystem what are the inter-VM communications that are going on. So I can see all the inter-VM communication. I can also see the incoming subnets that have access to this application, and I can see all the outgoing subnets that have access to this application. So immediately, if I see that, hey, a given subnet should not be accessing this set of VMs, I can go into any one of these flows and block that flow or monitor that flow for further details, right? So it becomes an easy way to actually visually see how your security compromised. Once a flow policy is created, that policy follows that VM or any VM that is tagged with the same policy. So effectively, I can create a set of policies that says any database that is within my ecosystem is cordoned off from all of these different subnets. And so if I create a new database VM and tag it as a database VM, that policy automatically gets applied to it. So if VMs move, and if you move VMs from one network to another, or from one cluster to another, and so on and so forth, you can have these security policies that actually follow that VM as well. So again, a huge advantage over creating VLANs and thinking about the more traditional way of doing security. Now, at its core, Nutanix is a data services company, and as such, what we are really good at doing is managing the customer's data and making sure that it's resilient and compliant and so on and so forth. But the other really good thing about Nutanix is how easy and simple we make the insights and the analytics piece so that customers can actually do meaningful things with that data as well. So here's an example of our built-in file server. So without the need for additional infrastructure, you can go check a box, deploy a file server, deploy an object store, and actually start running and creating, a namespace and shares and so on and so forth. But the real goodness is really on the analytics and insights that we give you back from that data. So an example of that is, here's my file server. I look at, who's accessing the files. I'm looking at what operations are being performed, what's the age of my data, what type of files are being created, what's the frequency of this creation, and so on and so forth. In addition, we have anomaly detection. So if anybody is randomly creating files, or doing a certain set of file operations, like for instance, during a ransomware attack, there's a heuristic of actions that is performed before a ransomware attack. And so we can pick up on those things and actually see that as an anomaly and prevent that from happening. So there's some huge benefits here in terms of preventing things like ransomware and so on. And then the last thing is really around audit capability. So who has access to your data? What frequency are they accessing? And the ability to slice and dice this in a way that's meaningful to the customer. Now, if you look at the database market, this is, I would say, a fairly underserved market with a huge opportunity in terms of the ability to actually go address this market need, right? So if you think about database and database administrators, what they do all day long is patch, secure, make sure that it's protected from ransomware. They manage the copies of the database. They scrub data for test and dev purposes, et cetera, et cetera. All of these things are sort of manual, and there isn't really tools and facilities for database administrators to do. And that's exactly what Era is. It is agnostic of the underlying database for the most part. So we support everything from Oracle to Postgres to SQL Server to MongoDB to MariaDB, and we provide the end-to-end lifecycle management of a database. So our DBA's job is that much easier with Nutanix database solutions. So what you see is the end-to-end portfolio of data or lifecycle management of these databases, everything from ransomware protection to copy data management to scrubbing for test and dev and so on and so forth. And we support all the major databases out there. Now, if you think about the equivalency in the public cloud, what you get is RDS. RDS for AWS is a $7 billion industry every year. And that's all they're doing is really managing Postgres. They don't even make the migration from whatever database you have to RDS simple. They have additional services that actually go do that. Whereas all of these tools are built right into the Nutanix NDB platform. All right, so that's looking at just your legacy on-prem and modern customers, like the modern on-prem customers. So you can see that there's a very strong value proposition to get them into a modern infrastructure like Nutanix, right? And most customers who are on legacy or are looking at HCI, they're probably looking at Nutanix, and there's a really strong value proposition as to why they should be on us. But now let's talk about customers who are on a cloud-first journey or a cloud-smart journey, and they're looking at certain workloads living in the cloud versus certain living on-prem, and what's the value proposition there, and how can we help these customers actually get to the cloud in a meaningful way? So first and foremost, what we did last year is we launched our ability to actually run the Nutanix cloud platform inside of AWS. So at the end of the day, Nutanix is a software company, and what we do is run our software on various underlying hardware. Our first cloud hardware happened to be AWS bare metal. So AWS already has racks and racks of servers. We just run Nutanix software on top of those servers, and then you get a Nutanix cluster pretty much living inside your public cloud. Now, the way we delivered on this is a little bit different than more the traditional ways of doing this, I suppose, which is that we took the time and effort to make sure that the customer doesn't have to do any heavy lifting, or customers not creating another silo as far as their cloud environment is concerned. So this is a customer that is already using AWS more than likely, probably has AWS services deployed, probably has a VPC configured, security policies configured, and so on and so forth. So we didn't want to disrupt any of that. So what we do is we ask the customer for the VPC in which they want to deploy the Nutanix ecosystem. And then from that point on, we go do all the heavy lifting to provision a Nutanix cluster inside that VPC, such that the customer doesn't have to manage and secure and do all of these things all over again just for a Nutanix ecosystem. Once it's inside your VPC, you can actually mix and match the Nutanix services and the AWS services as though it was local, right? And that allows the customer to take an on-prem Nutanix cluster, run some VMs here, and then migrate those VMs seamlessly back and forth. So you can take VMs from your private cloud ecosystem that's running Nutanix onto the public cloud. And this does not require you to re-architect the VM. It doesn't require to redesign the VM to make it cloud native. You just run that as a VM on top of the Nutanix platform inside of AWS. The other choice, like I said, is the ability to mix and match services. So sometimes you might want an application that you're running on-prem, but you wish you could use AWS data lake services on the back end, but you can't because of latency requirements. Well, this gives you the option to take that application as is, migrate it to the public cloud, and now leverage AWS data lake for the back end because it's no longer running in your private data center, it's running inside the public cloud ecosystem. The reverse is also true. Sometimes you may want to run applications in AWS, but then you require some on-prem backend footprint, and you can do that using the same way. So you can run those backend footprint on the Nutanix platform in the public cloud, and back up all your AWS content to that Nutanix ecosystem, and then bring that back to your on-prem data center. The good news here is we're not in the business of reselling AWS or anything to that effect. So the customer's existing AWS contracts exist. They're still basically getting that bill from AWS. So any cloud credits they have, they can leverage towards that. All we're doing is selling the software piece, which would be sold using the traditional method. For customers, this specifically for CIOs, this is a great thing because it actually gives them the choice of multiple clouds and having a seamless and sort of uniform deployment across these. So say, for instance, I'm in AWS and Azure, and today AWS is giving me a great price. So I actually move those workloads using the Nutanix Cloud Platform to AWS. But tomorrow Azure is giving me a better price, and I can actually run them on Azure just as well. So it really gives you that sort of level of arbitrage across these public clouds and the ability to move workloads across them as well. And last but not least, we're one of the unique vendors in the industry that allow license portability. So that same Nutanix software license that you run on your private data center can also run inside the public cloud and it's agnostic of which public cloud you run in. So again, full portability of licenses between public and private. For some of our more mature customers, they actually look at the Nutanix Cloud Platform not just for public clouds, but also for near public clouds. So an example of that is Equinix Metal. So many of you hopefully are familiar with Equinix as a company. They do provide co-location businesses, but they also have a hosted service called Equinix Metal. So this is just bare metal as a service. They have racks and racks of servers. You can bring other pieces of infrastructure up to Equinix Metal, and then you can have your entire private cloud running on Metal. The claim to fame here obviously is that Metal is about a hop, skip, and jump from AWS. So like I guess a couple of milliseconds latency between where your data center is and AWS's data center is. And so the benefit you get is you don't have to be in the public cloud, but you're like literally right next to the public cloud as far as where your data center is hosted. So if you're looking to mix and match between public and private, Metal gives you this great platform to run your hybrid environments on. So we do have a partnership, a very strong partnership with Equinix here, where you can go to Equinix Metal, deploy the Nutanix platform right there. All of that is automated for you. You now have a full Nutanix stack running inside of Metal, and now you're basically a couple of hop skips from AWS, Azure, GCP. All right, so now moving on to that cloud-first customer who has a significant on-prem deployment, which I would say is your vast majority of the customers that you're going to run into today. They have some form of cloud today, whether it's for SaaS applications, but they're looking more and more to see, does AWS make sense? Does Azure make sense? What workloads make sense to fit where? But when they do have all these decisions, or when they have made all these decisions, they need one platform to actually manage their cloud and on-prem in a more seamless fashion. So one example of that is day two operations. So I might have, for instance, provisioned VMs and so on and so forth, and I just want to do some basic infrastructure / VM management. And so this is something called where we have the ability to have playbooks. So here are 5 playbooks that I've actually deployed. And they're fairly simple in that they do a certain function, but I can tweak them however my business needs to operate. The system itself comes with a lot of different plays. or rather action galleries. So there's things that are built into the system that I can do. So things like Slack integration, things like REST APIs, and so on and so forth. So I don't have to create everything from scratch. And there's a description of what this action gallery does, right? Or rather what that play does. So here's an example of what a play looks like. So here I'm basically reducing the memory footprint for over-provisioned VMs. So if a VM has 32 gigs of memory, and we've seen historically that 16 gigs is plenty, then we will reduce those amount of memory, and so that way we're not wasting. Now this is specifically true more so on the cloud side than the on-prem side, but this could be agnostic of which side you want to run it on. So your playbooks, for instance, are going to look like this, where you go in and you say, okay, send an email, wait until a certain day of the week, set up a recovery point for the VM, power off the VM, reduce its memory footprint, power it back on, resolve the alert, and then email the admin that this was done. So it's a really simple playbook, but it's basically fully automated. It runs automatically as part of the system, and the admin really doesn't need to do anything. They get notified via email or Slack or whatever integration that you choose. Now, when you're looking at more advanced levels of automation, what you're looking to do is maybe integrate not just infrastructure or VM level granularity, but full app level granularity. And so this is taking a repeatable process and automating that at a much higher granularity. So an example of that is I'm doing a full app deployment. So I have a database manager managing a Postgres database with a web server front end and an object storage backend. Now, this is not your trivial single VM type of thing. It's a very complicated blueprint that needs to be agnostic and needs to be deployed in a repeatable fashion. Things like security and other things can be incorporated here, including things like scale. So once I create this blueprint, it's basically telling me what action kicks off what next action. So, I have to create this one first, and then that triggers the deployment of this one, which triggers the deployment of this one, and so on and so forth. So you can see the dependency map with the arrows pointing. And so, the blueprint gets kicked off. It basically starts the entire process of, everything from provisioning this to patching it to making sure it scales when the number of connections hit a certain point, and so on and so forth. What I can do is once I hit this publish button, it basically takes me to a self-service portal. So any users that have access to that portal can now go click and deploy that repeatable process. Now, this can be very agnostic. It can run for on-prem Nutanix, on-prem VMware, public cloud AWS, public cloud Azure. So it really is just hooking onto these various ecosystems via APIs and provisioning that for you. So it can be done in a very agnostic fashion, regardless of which public cloud or private cloud ecosystem you're looking to deploy on. Now, once you have these applications running in these various clouds, you want to look at the operating cost of these various cloud ecosystems as well. So here I'm logging onto my AWS cloud. As you can see, I don't spend a lot on AWS, as you can see, so not a huge spend on AWS, but I can immediately see which services I am consuming. I'm looking at my spend analysis broken down monthly. Any anomalies in my spend? Did someone go haywire and spin up a whole bunch of things that I wasn't aware of? And most importantly, what's my spend efficiency in the public cloud? So as you know, it's very easy to spin things up in the public cloud, but then that cost gets really out of whack really quickly. And you want to make sure that you're keeping your spend efficiency as high as possible. One way to do that is to use our optimize capability within the cloud operating cost model. And so what you can see here is you can see that this VM is powered on. It's barely using any resources. Well, one question to ask is, can this be powered off? And maybe the answer is there are some spikes on certain days, and maybe it's running a batch operation on these specific times. But rather than powering it off, the system is recommending that it's a T2 micro instance. It can actually make do just fine with a T2 nano instance, which will save me $5.83 every month. Multiply that by the number of VMs of this size and this scale that I have, and you can see that the cost really starts to add up and the savings really starts to add up. So it's a simple way to think about, VMs that are provisioned but no one's using, or VMs such as this that can be further optimized in terms of cost, so that I'm actually not getting this massive bill at the end of every month. Now, this product can be agnostic. So as I mentioned earlier, we were looking at our AWS platform, but now I'm looking at the Nutanix platform. And here I can see that the Nutanix platform, I have a pretty sizable spend. My clusters are broken down by spend as well. And so I have to do some inputs to say what is the cost of compute and storage and memory. And once I've done that, it can actually spin up the cost for various modules. I can look at my spend analysis every month and my capacity analysis and so on and so forth. Another piece that this can also do is allocate budget. So if you're managing multiple teams and each team is using AWS, Azure, and on-prem Nutanix, you can allocate a budget to that team, and then you can look at the more holistic spend across these various public and private cloud ecosystems. If you wanted to take that a step further, we do have the ability to show you chargeback capabilities as well. So, so we can actually show the business, okay, what is it that they're spending, and you can allocate that from a chargeback, showback perspective. And then there's a whole bunch of reports we can create from that in terms of slicing and dicing of information. Now, another aspect when you're in multiple domains is how are you doing from a regulatory standpoint, right? So every business needs to be compliant to various regulations, and some of those are very important and need to be taken very seriously. So, so if I'm in healthcare, for instance, I have to run HIPAA, or I have to be compliant against HIPAA, and so what we do is in the platform we have a bunch of compliance checks that we have written. So there's about 500 or so compliance checks, um, and these compliance checks are run periodically against your entire real estate to see how you're doing from a compliance standpoint. Now, again, here you'll notice that I'm basically pointing it at AWS, and I might have different regulatory compliance checks that I need to run on AWS versus what I run on Azure versus what I run on-prem. And that could be dependent on which workloads I'm running inside of each cloud. So as you can see, I'm basically pointing it at all my Azure POPs, and I can see the ones with a green check mark are compliant, and anything in yellow and red is out of compliance. Now, where it is possible, we will get back into compliance, and so that way, the system kind of auto corrects and auto heals. But where it's not possible, we will give you detailed steps on how to get back into compliance. Now, similarly, you can see here that we can do the same thing for a Nutanix cluster. So if you have multiple Nutanix clusters spread across various geos, we can show you which ones are compliant, which ones are not. And again, similar things as far as getting back into compliance automated. All right, so last but not least, just a couple of words on where we're taking this platform sort of from a future-looking standpoint. So the first is around multi-cloud data services. So what we really want to do is we have the ability to spin up files and objects and our database management platform on the on-prem Nutanix, and we really want to make it cloud agnostic. So the ability to take that data service and run that in AWS or Azure, such that it's completely agnostic of the Nutanix platform. So if I'm running a Postgres database inside of AWS and I want to basically provide the end-to-end lifecycle management of that, I should be able to do that. Now, if I want to take that same one and now run it on Azure instead, because that's who my cloud provider of choice is, now I can actually seamlessly migrate that as well, right? Similar things for files or objects or for security governance and so on and so forth. So just make it really agnostic of the cloud it's running on. Now, one way to do that is to take this data service and run it on a platform which quote unquote can run on Nutanix, but also can be obfuscated from Nutanix and run in the public clouds. And so we're looking at containers as the ecosystem to doing that. So by taking this data service and making it cloud native, we can actually run it on Nutanix, we can run it on Azure, it can run on AWS, and it's really using that native underlying data store. So today, when it's running on Nutanix, it'll use the Nutanix data store. When it's running on Azure, it'll use EBS or whatever underlying system there is. And so you'll basically be getting the SLAs of whatever the underlying storage subsystem provides. But the good news is whatever underlying storage subsystem it uses, Nutanix will provide the data gravity, will solve for the data gravity problem. So in other words, if I moved a VM or a container from AWS to Azure, Nutanix's platform will make sure that that storage, underlying storage, is also portable, right? And that's the benefit you're going to get with such a solution. So that's pretty much the high-level overview of the entire Nutanix platform. As you can see, we're really trying to solve customer problems based on what their business needs are asking them to do. The journey really is, or the value proposition really is very strong for what we call our mode 1 and mode 2 customers. It's probably the weakest, like I said, because mostly it's future looking for are mode 4 customers that are born in the cloud. So that's not necessarily the market segment that Nutanix has the strongest solution for, but we have a very strong value proposition for those mode 3 customers that span between public and private. And so we bring a lot of goodness for those customers in terms of a more holistic approach, thinking about their application deployment and various operating modes. So thank you for taking the session. Hopefully you got a lot out of it, and happy selling.